When Anthony goes to Germany, we met Mundi, and he said, "Oh, my investor is actually coming by this evening. You should pitch him." So the only, or one of the only games seed funds that existed at the time basically showed up for that in LVP. And 15 minutes into a pitch that we didn't feel we were ready to give or didn't feel like we'd honed in yet, like they're calling the rest of the partners and saying, "You got to get on the phone this evening." It's like 8 p.m. or whatever now, and hear the pitch. And they made an offer like the next day.
Welcome to the Gaming Founders Podcast, a show where we interview the founders that have shaped the gaming industry. I'm Aidan Chen, the CEO of Pragma, a back-end game engine founded by engineering leaders that built the platforms for some of the largest live service games, like League of Legends, Fortnite, Destiny 2, and Plants vs. Zombies 2. Pragma powers services like accounts, matchmaking, and player data for the world's most ambitious live service games.
And I'm Kevin Zane, partner at Upfront Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based in LA and San Francisco. I lead game investments both in studios as well as the pick and shovel tools that power game developers and content creators to do their best work, including Pragma. We interview founders on their origin stories, the tactics that help them survive and thrive, and key lessons for anyone interested in building the next generation of leading gaming companies. Learn more and subscribe today at pragma.gg/gamingfounders. Welcome to the Season 1 finale of the Gaming Founders Podcast. Thank you to all the listeners out there for participating in our little corner of the gaming world and sharing all of your encouragement and feedback so far. Stay tuned. We'll be back with Season 2 very soon. Now, today, I'm thrilled to introduce Aidan Karabaich, co-founder and chief creative officer of Singularity 6. Aidan honed his creative skills over the last decade at notable design houses like Obsidian and Riot Games before striking out to build the multiplayer community sim game, Palia. Singularity 6 is one of the first alumni studios from Riot, has attracted significant funding from venture capital investors and strategics, and to many's delight is building in the rather underserved area of cozy games. It would not be an understatement to say Palia's launch on Nintendo Switch this holiday season is hotly anticipated. Aidan shares many lessons so far, from infusing product leadership principles into design and creative work to effective interviewing for critical thinking. Now on to our conversation with Aidan.
Hey, Aidan. Thanks for joining us on the Gaming Founders Podcast.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
So just to get started, what is your early story? How did you decide to get into games?
So it almost depends on how far back we're going. I mean, I think like so many people in the game industry, we found that passion really early. My grandmother had an Atari and NES, and I've still never beaten her at Pac-Man.
Wow.
I never was able to get that crown. She just stopped playing when she felt like it, not when the game could kill her, because it couldn't. I had a family atmosphere that was frankly really supportive compared to a lot of people's stories that I've heard there. When I was in college, I did economics, a bit of computer science, and I was still honestly at that time not taking, I didn't see the path to getting into games. And so I was looking at law schools as I was finishing up there. And then my father is the one who comes to me and says, "Look at this gaming school, part of UCF down in Florida. You should go check it out." And so I get on a plane and I go check it out and I meet some of the professors, and I am just in love and dazzled by this space and this atmosphere and what the people are doing who are there. And I just hard pivot on a dime, and this is what I'm doing. And so I had a great experience at FIA, Florida Interactive Entertainment Academy. It was actually started by EA, and I think they hire a pretty large percentage of the graduates every year. That was just an incredible jumpstart for me. It was really a kind of spending 14, 16 hours a day just jamming on games with people and learning hyper fast with a bunch of other people that were passionate in this space and really making the most of that time. And, that catapulted me into my first job.
Was there any particular track you were studying or focused on, or how did it work?
So they did have 3 different tracks that you can apply to get into. One is production, and they kind of include design within that, which was always really the area I was most passionate about, engineering and art as well. you really kind of figure out an identity in a place while you're working there. It's a lot of very hands-on stuff versus just lectures. You'll do rapid prototype teams where they put you with 2, 3, 4 other people, and you're going to make a game in a week or 2 weeks, and culminating in a larger group where I actually get to be the project lead. And they take you through a process where you're going to get green light. You're potentially going to get canceled. My game got canceled. That's life. Then you get picked up by another team. You got to go get another job on another team and find a new role. And there was so much about that I felt like prepared us and prepared me for what work was going to look like. My first job felt easy compared to FIA.
And what was your first thing at a school? Was it in a game design discipline or at a certain studio?
So the first full-time job that I had, I did a short internship for Cartoon Network, was at 38 Studios, which was fun to read. Jason Schreier has a chapter on the 38 studio events, if you've read that. So it was cool to read that with some insider perspective on it as you're going through. And that was just another great opportunity for me. It, of course, famously blew up in a very public way, but it was a company that people were extremely passionate about. At the end, nobody got paid for a significant number of weeks, and almost everybody still showed up and worked. And so I was actually, I had worked on a dungeon, a first piece of content in that area for the game with a few other people. And I was pitching it to external people as my first job in the industry to try and save us, to get financial capital. So I knew it was a real downside for a lot of people, but I developed so many great connections, and I got an opportunity to step up and show what I could do. And I was in a technical design capacity at the time because I had a pretty good, more in like scripting, kind of like light coding with good design sensibilities, and I got to show that off there. So it was a lot of fun.
That was like sort of the MMO wave, right? To some extent. I mean, 38 was one of them, but I think yeah. I guess you worked at a bunch of studios. Obviously, you ended up at Riot. Did Tom Cadwell hire you, or how did you end up over at Riot?
I did speak to Riot a couple times before I actually eventually ended up there. Even though I played so much League of Legends, too much League of Legends, I actually, again, massive respect for the people on that team and that project. But I wanted to work on something new. I was excited to see what Riot was going to do new. So I was very much kind of in a space where, when they're working on something that speaks, more into the areas that I've been focusing in, absolutely let me know. And so my significant other at the time eventually started working at Riot before me. So that nexus started to pull me even stronger in that direction. I was at Obsidian at the time, and I went to GDC, and there were just rioters all over the place, it felt like, that particular year. And I, sat on the grass with a few people there, and that kind of kicked things off. They were, really kind of investing in the R&D department at that time. They had at one point a rule where you had to work on League of Legends before you were allowed to work in R&D. And somehow I was able to subvert that, or I got right into it when it was more gray space. And so I jumped into R&D, and that was a great experience.
Seems like a lot of people get recruited through GDC at Riot. That was like a really good pipeline for them. I'm just like, wow, it's crazy.
They were doing a lot of great talks. I saw a talk of Tom Cadwell's that I was very impressed by, but there were many people from Riot doing those talks there. And honestly, you could see the reputation of Riot in the game industry really ballooning in a huge way. You could feel it. And that just became really attractive. And the thing that really cemented it for me is the way they spoke about design. And from those early, sitting on the grass at GDC conversations, and from, the way Tom Cadwell articulated, the way the company thought about these sorts of things, it had a real sense of academic rigor to it that was extremely attractive to me. I'm very analytical, and they have a kind of bit more of a scientific rigor to it that was really appealing to me.
Can you tease some of that out? Like what, maybe even before, but also during, what did you learn from, I don't know if how directly you work with Tom, or even just the other designers in that discipline? Like what did that rigor look like?
Tom was my boss for part of the time that I was there. My initial manager and team lead was Ryan Scott, and I learned just so much from both of those individuals, both just really exceptional designers. Probably the biggest thing that I would start off with is at Riot, everyone is expected to be able to communicate why something is a good decision. It's not enough to intuitively feel that, something is a good decision, that it's just a taste call or something like that. Those are important elements, and it's not that there's not a strong level of respect for where intuition can lead you. But the real art and craft in a lot of ways is seen in being able to break down these pieces of a design, understand why it works at a fundamental level, and then thus take that and generate innovation because you can move this particular piece, separate it from these other ones, and move it to a different context and articulate why you think it's going to work in that space. And as you get more senior, the expectation is you can be more accurate, more sophisticated in your ability to do that. But they also are very rigorous about the way we were doing playtesting, where you don't approach playtesting again from this sort of like organic space and just sort of like open-ended, what do you feel like? You go into that playtest with a specific hypothesis, a set of things that you are trying to prove or disprove, validate, and you iterate from there. But it's a very intentional process, and it made the R&D component just really exciting to be a part of as well, because we were exploring such broad spaces, and so we really were taking puzzle pieces apart and putting them back together in just really exciting different ways.
Is there maybe an example you can give on that kind of hypothesis building? That is a tricky balance, right? Especially maybe during the earlier days, of a project. Like, how did you guys, what would be like the type of hypothesis you would try to test? What's too detailed versus what's too generic to be useless?
It might be easier to talk about my current project a little bit more without, again, we haven't revealed a ton yet, but I think there are some areas that I can talk about kind of in a more broad sense. One of them is around different projects within the community sim space approach time of day in a different manner. And so, one option is you could link it very directly with real life. And there are certain, strengths and challenges associated with that. And then you basically have every hour increment you can possibly think, or minute increment throughout the entire rest of the spectrum. And you could even make it on an individual player or set of player basis. And so there are a lot of components associated with that you can, dive in and consider. And so, a big part to start is always research, understanding your player, understanding the current atmosphere, what expectations people might be taking into that space when you're trying to work on something in that problem area. And then based on what you're trying to achieve, for us, some of our core pillars that we developed for the game, one of them is hygge. It's a Danish concept, kind of translates to this sense of coziness, comfort, contentment. And so when we're looking at that decision, which ones are going to support that kind of feeling? Which ones are going to create pressure or friction in a way that we think is disruptive kind of from that cozy sense of player flow? We approached those play tests, and it was very easy to test different kind of timescales and in a white box phase of development around, what were the specific goals, what were the game pillars, what were the values around why we think this was going to be the best thing for players. And then, both by bringing in external players to come to the office and, through our own playtests and trying out things on each other, try to validate what that outcome was. And certainly went through a lot of iterations, but feel like we have a lot of increased confidence in the direction we went through.
Did you all arrive at a timescale outcome, or and maybe that's too specific, or like what was the outcome, I guess?
I don't think it's a crazy spoiler, but in our case, it's an hour in our project. It directly is a full time of day cycle. And we did some smooshing, I guess, if that's a real word, of what, how light or dark it is during specific phases of the game experience to optimize, again, for those kind of high level values that we had and we wanted to create while still conveying this sense of a day. that was ultimately the decision. We locked it to real life time. So you always know as a player, oh, it's 3:00. I know exactly what time it is in Palia. And I know exactly what I could do at 3:15 or at 3:30 and at 3:45. And that's a pretty powerful understanding when that's an impactful thing in terms of what you can do in a game, or how things might be different for how you can kind of essentially make an appointment with the game even when you're not in it. And it also just, gave enough breadth where, say, a common mechanic in community sim experiences would be, say a certain fish only spawns in the evening or in the morning or something like that. It gave enough time associated with those blocks that people could legitimately chase that without feeling an excessive amount of pressure or time pinch to try and achieve those goals and make progress.
Going back to sort of like your R&D experience at Riot before, I definitely want to spend a lot of time on Singularity, but what did those weekly interactions look like with Tom in terms of he was managing you? What was greenlighting a project even look like? What would that process look like from a week-to-week basis?
When I was there, it was still before they had released another project out of R&D. So it was something that was still being figured out in a lot of ways. And you could tell processes were being developed, they were being iterated on. And so it definitely did shift in the time that I was there. I had basically weekly one-on-ones with Tom. Some of it was more career-based, of course, the manager components, and other ones were very project-focused and oriented around, whatever the, big outcomes or problems that we were trying to solve. And so typically I would present the strategy that we were thinking for the game framework overall, for how we were going to solve specific problems. And I would use that as a feedback loop to get from, his kind of like outsider perspective around, what things he thought might work or be worth investing in, and, how that might map to, the vision and the expectations we had from stakeholders.
And then I guess you met Anthony at Riot, is that right?
So Anthony was my past girlfriend's manager when I was at Obsidian. So
okay.
we developed a relationship before I was even at Riot. Would go on, out in groups. Riot hosted a variety of nice social get-togethers that we got to spend a lot of time at, and it really just sort of flourished into a friendship outside of work before I was even there. And so, transitioning over to Riot just made all of that so much easier, where, I was no longer commuting down to Irvine from LA, taking up all my time during the week. And we connected really early on. We were both super passionate MMO players and, spoke ad nauseum, even, without trying, about all sorts of different great experiences we'd had there. And frankly, where we felt like there were still tons of innovation opportunities that weren't being chased. And really, as you mentioned earlier, we were in an atmosphere where MMOs were not being greenlit in the same way that they were in the 2000s and maybe even early teens of this past decade.
What was the process like of deciding to work together on a new company? Like, did those conversations start happening when you were at Riot?
It was a really kind of crazy thing to me, where the point where we really decided to jump in and do this felt like 15 doors had all opened at the same time. And I was just staring at this opportunity that I always was interested in and wanted the opportunity to do at some point, but I didn't know exactly when or how. So we had always, as I said, been having conversations about game opportunities. I'll list off some of those doors that were open at the same time. So, I was at a bit of a transition point in terms of my role at Riot. And so I was kind of considering things pretty broadly. We had, high level opportunity spaces that we talked about quite a lot that we were very excited about. Anthony got more serious about considering it. We spoke at his holiday party the year before we started it, and we're kind of threw around the idea of actually trying to do this for real and starting to investigate that in a big way. And it was pretty wild what happened once we actually started focusing on it. I think that was the big surprise that really, like, we didn't expect like jet fuel to hit right off the bat with that in terms of us being able to pursue that quickly. But it was something that once we started working on it, we got really excited about it. And once we started looping in other people to help us, to help answer very basic questions, and there were so many people in our past and our Riot that were very willing to lend their insight and their expertise there, that helped us answer a lot of questions. What do we need to even get this started? Do we have to have a prototype? Do we have to bootstrap this for a period of time ourselves? What opportunities even exist? Who should we even talk to? There's 10,000 questions that we kind of looped through at that time. Again, I'd only kind of touched on a couple of the things that I felt like were just perfect timing. There are so many things about your personal life. Is this a good decision? I feel like I'm a little bit on the risk-seeking side of things versus risk-averse as a human. And I think that maybe preclude you a little bit to this as well.
I have to set the stage here, actually, for listeners, because I guess when you guys raised, what is it, 2018, the first?
2018.
Okay. And at the time, I don't think there had been like a lot of sort of these cross-platform live service type games that have gone on to raise. And I'm going to put Kevin on the spot because I know you and Anthony at some point pitched him. Kevin, what was the venture view of games at the time? What were you thinking? You know, obviously you got pitched. What were you thinking? What was the landscape like at the time?
Oh, first of all, I was stupid and ultimately did not invest. So just putting that out there. But, you know, to your point, Andreessen hasn't even started investing in games, right? Actually, you guys became, I think, their first investment a year later or a year and a half later or something like our second investment. There were barely any gaming specific funds to speak of. And I think, you know, we were still coming out of this whole period where investors, especially in Silicon Valley, thought games are hit driven and really hard to predict and not a venture investable category, frankly. And all of that would go on to change over the next couple of years. You know, not just because of the pandemic, I think also because, frankly, you finally start to see some of these true, very long-term cross-platform games get built and continue to draw users in. And turns out, you know, when games work, they're basically the best retaining consumer products arguably out there. And so if you're going to be a consumer investor, you might as well invest in games is I think kind of how the rhetoric started to change.
So Aidan, you went out in this landscape of VCs being pretty skeptical of games. What was your early experience getting that seed round done like?
So again, extraordinarily lucky in a way. I do want to talk about the atmosphere a little bit, but I feel like it was a pretty wild story for how we got started initially. Look at the power of having a good manager at a big company. Anthony's boss at Riot, very well-connected individual, Ali Otarson, who is at Makers Fund now, heard that this was something that we were going to pursue. You know, we kind of intentionally sort of consulted with him, and he just dug in immediately and said, "Oh my gosh, I think this is like you all should totally chase this." And was like, "When are you going to Europe? You need to go to Europe now. These are the people you need to see. I'm going to like create your whole itinerary of, you know, what's going to happen and how you all are going to get going." And I had to convince Anthony a little bit to get out the door and do this kind of wild seeming trip. But at the end of the day, you know, he did it and met a lot of founders of companies in Europe, like Bosa, that were super helpful in terms of giving us insights there. And when Anthony goes to Germany, we met Mundi, and he said, "Oh, my investor is actually coming by this evening. You should pitch him." So the only, or one of the only games seed funds that existed at the time basically showed up for that in LVP. And 15 minutes into a pitch that we didn't feel we were ready to give or didn't feel like we'd honed in yet, like they're calling the rest of the partners and saying, "You got to get on the phone this evening." It's like 8 p.m. or whatever now, and hear the pitch. And they made an offer like the next day. And wow. This is not like the typical thing or not the typical thing in this atmosphere. But I think the concept that we had was something that very much spoke to LVP's investing strategy, where they had a very well articulated sense of where they felt games were going and why. And that allowed them to, you know, when they saw something, they could have conviction around it and move really quickly. And they've been just an incredible partner throughout this whole experience the whole time. Like, couldn't ask for a better initial investor coming into the company. So that was a weird way to get started.
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to hone in on that because I think a lot of times that first round of funding is not necessarily about how shiny your deck is. And I mean, team is a big part of it, but I think your thesis, to your point, is also a huge part of it. And maybe you can walk through like, what was your thesis and how did you arrive at that thesis? And maybe even how that has shifted over time, or maybe it's just you've maintained that similar vision throughout the whole thing.
I think any good thesis, you're able to look at from a couple of different perspectives and try to poke holes in it from different directions, and that it basically holds water. And so, from a player perspective, we're seeing the community sim genre have several big hits in it, and have this like growing sense of respect for it. Even at that time, the indie space is not nearly as flourished as it has today, but has a sense as a player that this was something that was going to get a lot bigger, and that there was so many opportunities on the table associated with these projects that, when we went and looked at what we're doing every day, where we're making live service products, we're updating them consistently, we're offering them to players in a more of like a free-to-play model, where we're operating them across multiple platforms and making the accessibility bars really open to players. And when we're putting this big emphasis on the ability to do this genre, this experience in a multiplayer social atmosphere, just all seemed like major big components that could create a really incredible opportunity in this space. That was really exciting. You kind of switch over to the business components, and a lot of those, albeit, kind of like buzzwords almost, also really speak to, the business side, to the investor component associated with that opportunity. And we were able to look at the audiences associated with each of, the existing kind of big hits in that space, and make some pretty reasonable extrapolations. If you take a game that is only on one platform and you make it across these multiple vectors, and you add these other components that have these kinds of impacts when they've been applied to other games, other genres, the TAM, total addressable market, on the business side, really spoke to a lot of people. And so I think that was the big thing that hit people early on. And we have made some pivots, but I think the highest level components of that still come from a place of very strong belief and orientation from us.
What were the community sims that inspired you at the time?
The obvious players. It was not a very well supported genre. If you go back in time in a big way, early days, you had The Sims, where it was basically a game on its own. And there was no other game that you could really point to that much that had a ton of similarities with that kind of player experience and that motivation. And, you ripple through the various Nintendo products in the space, and then you look through at the big indie hits, and we looked at each of those and, what we thought was done really well in each of those spaces. So, Stardew, Animal Crossing, Fantasy Life, there's a bunch there.
What was the early building of your team like? I guess the first 10 hires or so? What types of people were you looking for? Did you have hiring principles that you had formed already? Like, what kind of advice can you give people as they build out their early team?
So we had developed, a strategic canvas and company values from the very early days that we continued to iterate on as we went. That was a big part of our hiring practice even early on. I think one of the really exciting things about doing a new company was the opportunity to set a new cultural standard and build that up from day one, figuring out what we thought those company values were, that fundamentally that we believed if we were great at these things, that it would make us uniquely positioned as a company to take advantage of the kind of opportunities that we wanted to chase, which are, largely blue ocean, untapped or undertapped audiences that we could understand as players and really chase and have a lot of belief in. And so that translated a lot into our hiring process. It translated a lot into the kind of people we tried to hire. We have had two other kind of components as part of that strategy. We hired very senior early on. We also really focused on doers. Anthony and I were very much doers until, frankly, probably too late. We probably should have stopped being doers in any capacity earlier than we did. in retrospect in some spaces. But that was a really big thing. We wanted to hire people that we could trust, that were really passionate about the vision and the project that we were trying to achieve, and that could take an area of the experience and work within the vision and the strategy that Anthony and I were working together, but really kind of pick up that baton and run with it. And I think we got extraordinarily lucky or fortunate in terms of what some of those hires resulted in.
Can you a lot of people, especially when they've just left, great places, there's some shortcuts, right? Like you hire people who you already worked with previously at Riot, or, hey, look, I'm building a community sim. Let me just go find other people who've also worked on community sims. Like, did you try to use any of those tactics? Did they work? Did they not work? Especially in the early days.
There was definitely a difficulty with hiring people that worked on community sims. If you look across the entire United States and Canada, the number of people working on similar projects in that space is very narrow. So we had to kind of go like genre adjacent in order to find some people with relevant experience. There was tons of passion, and we did really look for that. And we looked for people that had a lot of play experience, a lot of hours accumulated in the genres that we were looking at. But it was difficult to, outside of EA at Maxis, to find places where there was direct experience. We actually, in terms of looking at past companies, is of course a huge source. Referrals are a huge thing. Having worked with somebody in the past can jumpstart this sense of trust that you can have with somebody in a really positive way. At the same time, we didn't want to just be the culture of the place that, we had just moved on from. We wanted to be building up our own thing. So we were very conscious about not trying to create an in crowd as a result of the hiring practices and approaches that we had. And, looking at that at all levels, that it wasn't a thing where individual contributors on the team might come from diverse places, but the leadership or the executive team is like all anchored around this one thing. And then you kind of get groupthink around, a particular way of approaching things. So we were very intentional around trying to diversify those perspectives, across all, DEI components, everything across the company from really day one. But there were some amazing hires. The first backend engineer that we had was basically a referral. That's a really difficult thing to hire in the early days, somebody with a lot of strength there that you can trust to make some of the foundational decisions at that time for an MMO. And that was hugely impactful. So who can you get, of course, is a big component. Right. But what are the areas that are really critical for you to get right? And those were areas that we had a lot more flex on in terms of our, diversity of thought goals, when something was so critical that we just had to get it right and we had to move quickly. It's always a balance between, those other goals and moving quickly and getting the right people.
Yeah, even more critical because Pragma did not exist back then, unfortunately.
I know. See, timing, you get lucky in some ways and unlucky in others. So we'll chalk that one up to the loss.
Exactly. You guys are now over 180 people, I think. It's much bigger. And you've hired a lot more designers. What makes a great designer? How do you hire for that specific discipline? Especially because I imagine that's probably something you have lots of opinions about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things I could speak to here and a lot of learnings I had on the past. I think we're going to have to change this interview right after this podcast goes out, because I'm sure everybody's going to Google it now that I say it. But one of the interviews that we really think is very important for the design team is our critical thinking interview. We actually do a McKinsey case study that people go through, and typically it is the first time people have ever experienced an interview like this, and it contributes to the fact that I'm perceived to be the scary interviewer to have on the panel. I'm a little steel-faced in some ways, but also it's this very open-ended problem where, fundamentally you have to think like a product lead in order to get to good answers there. You have to take a step back and think about so many different perspectives for, the challenges that could go wrong in the given case study. And you need to be intentional about the process that you take in order to develop and get to a good answer there. So critical thinking, I think, is really huge. If I'm looking at product leads, looking at designers, And it's something that I really see even early in career. It's something where you can see a lot of strength there. So I really look for that in a big way. There are a lot of other components. Creativity is, of course, something that comes up in a big way. And I'm a big believer that that's something that can be learned in a big way, that you can improve at intentionally. And that, exposing yourself to a wide variety of media and mediums and games is just building up this lexicon of touch points that you have that you can potentially bring together. Like, you need to invest, you need to be passionate enough that that's something that you're willing to do in your free time, and the impacts that you get from that in terms of what you can bring to the table and how it hones your intuition and other components are really impactful. So we've developed a set of competencies internally in design. Those are a couple of them. I always assess designers as product leads as well. So everything that, if you go Google a product lead, I think a great designer is training to be a great product lead, if not one already.
That makes sense. You guys went on and raised, several rounds of funding. I know many founders are in the position where they've maybe raised their seed round and they're sort of figuring out, okay, I have to raise my Series A or B and whatever it takes to get to production. Do you have any advice on the level of resolution or the components that you might focus on in order to get to a good pitch deck or a pitch in terms of is it just a really nice vertical slice? Are you trying to answer certain questions? Is it, maybe those aren't the key milestones, but money is important, obviously. And if you run out, then you can't get to the finish line. So any thoughts there, advice? You guys are one of the few that have gone on and done it, multiple times now.
I'll try to answer for, projects that, of course, look more familiar or more similar to what we're doing. I think there are a lot of other contexts that maybe some of these things wouldn't be true on. We still very much raised on vision more than the game or the project itself in the Series A. It became less and less true as you went forward over time, but absolutely it was still a vision raise. I think some big things that people looked at during that time, in what ways had we been able to validate any component of the vision in any way that could look even a little bit like real players in this audience, having some actual progress associated with that. So we did bring in people early on to play entirely white box prototypes where you could pretend to walk through our game loop for the most part. And, people could speak to that. We've always had a bit of a data leaning at the company and had that as a bit of a strength at the company. And so I think having that in any form that you can provide, any of that research, I think helps validate that and even show that that's going to be something that you're going to be good at or you're going to care about as you go into later rounds. That it's not just going to be based on, we continue to just believe this is going to be a good idea. Show in some way that, hey, we're going to be testing our hypotheses. And if you put your money into this company, it's going to be able to, increase our effectiveness at doing that as we grow. So audience validation is definitely a big one. Of course, you need to show that you can build a team a bit in that time. Can you hire other great people? Do other great people want to work for you? Are they excited about this idea? There's been such a huge competition for talent across the industry. If you can't show that you can be a nexus that is going to pull other people to really be able to fund this. We spent 35% of our time, the entire time across the whole company on hiring, Anthony and I both.
Wow.
Huge dedication to build a team of this side around that and to maintain the kind of hiring bar that we're trying to hire at. So that's a huge commitment associated with it. And yes, we had a vertical slice. It looked pretty good at the time. Obviously, later things look a lot better. One of our early investors said concept art, they never believe it. It looks nice, but only is real when you see it in 3D. So we tried to get some things that got pretty close to the concept art to show that, hey, this is something that we're actually going to be able to achieve. So I think that was helpful. And then, like I said, you had something you could walk through the game experience, even though some parts of it were hand waved. Famously, we had hunting in the game and we didn't have any mechanics for it. So all you did is walk up to a creature I made out of boxes and you hit F on it and you got meat, and that was hunting.
It's better than us. Our stuff is you just push win game because we're just a platform.
Nice. Yes.
And you
game
just
was
win.
won. You go to the next. Yeah.
You guys have been in development since, it's been what, 5 years now?
5 years. Yeah. I was 32 to start, 37 now. Your life changes in that timeline almost inevitably. So,
yeah, I mean, MMOs are obviously just monsters and to build. What are we don't know when you're launching yet. I don't think you're going to tell us, but what kinds of things are you looking for before you're quote unquote ready? It's like, what is a big sort of moment for you all where you're like, okay, I think we are good to go live with this thing?
Well, it does kind of go back to those data components. We don't feel like we can fully prove that this product is going to run or at what level it is but there is a lot of validation we can do that can notably increase confidence. We've run a number of alpha tests, some of them 4 weeks, 6 weeks in length, because we're trying to get reads around long-term retention. Obviously, we look at that data with a lot of caveats. Everybody knows we're going to delete their whole character, which is a huge part of investing in an MMO at the end. And, they know it's a limited term and experience. So, they know this window's going away, but we still think there's a lot of value that we can get out of those things. And frankly, you still see a lot of alphas out there where players don't play more than 15 minutes or an hour. And so we're very much looking for having large cohorts of players and, picking intentionally different groups to come in and try to have this be as an authentic, like real audience test as possible, to come in that, to validate our retention, to validate, is our monetization strategy working? Again, going back to, this is the theory. We're pursuing free to play. We published a blog article around our approach to monetization here, but we're trying to prove it before we go live that this is something that is going to work and work at the kind of scale that we can show numbers around. And the last thing is, internally, is your company ready? I think that's a really hard pivot to make. We've been developing a game and trying to pretend to be a live service product and doing a whole bunch of things and switching a whole bunch of systems at points we thought were right in order to be in that space. But what is a must and what is a should and what is a could in terms of tools that we have and internal release processes that we do and how many bugs do we have in the game before we turn the keys on that particular component. So, do we have confidence in each of those components? And then is the team ready? Is the game ready from like a quality perspective? Each of those things.
Maybe on the corollary side, over the last 5 years, what's been some of the biggest challenges you guys have faced, especially maybe ones that, were less predictable or ones that you weren't looking out for?
About 15 things went through my mind when you asked that. So we can definitely iterate through things for sure. One of the things that was a challenging early, prototype time decision for us was the overall server structure for the game. Ultimately, a core part of our thesis started from the idea of really sharing this experience with other people in a community. And parts of the way we wanted to execute against that early on just proved unfeasible from a technological leading to a cost perspective. And so that resulted in a big soul-searching kind of pivot for us to figure out, okay, well, we understand this core, this essence that we're trying to create in the game, but this particular approach that we can even see is getting us where we want to go. We just can't actually make into a live product at any scale because it costs us too much on the back-end infrastructure to ship that out. And maybe we can do that 10, 20 years from now when we subvert the laws of physics in different ways with new engines or something. So still holding on to some of that dream for the future.
AI is going to solve it all.
There we go. That was a big, difficult pivot for us because you could feel a lot of it and it was exciting, and yet it was not, you could not have that. It was like the forbidden fruit. And fortunately, we did find another way to get towards those experiences in a roundabout way, but it was definitely a lot of discovery and soul searching to get around that. So that's more of like a product focused pivot that we had to look at. I mean, could talk in any realm.
What about maybe anything I'm just trying to think about things that, will be more, that might apply across companies or startups, right? And whether it's maybe more team or timelines or budgeting or anything like that.
Hiring is a big one that I think people maybe haven't thought about the kind of strength or lift that is potentially. I wish we had hired a recruiter earlier. Again, think about your founders spending 35% of their time for 5 years doing this. Like I sourced a lot of people for some of those early roles. So I think finding ways where you can still uphold your quality bar, but maintain more of your development time, I think would be a really critical thing that both Anthony and I would want to do a little bit differently going through the next time. Scaling yourself is a huge thing. I definitely made some mistakes on that going through. I've often kind of described it like this, where you need to have your feet firmly planted on the ground as you scale. Because if you're scaling from a perspective where you're already on your heels, you're always one issue away from being on your butt. And being on your butt is really bad for everybody involved in a role like the ones you're coming into as a founder, as a company. The kind of impacts that can have, it could be dramatically different, but they can span every possible challenge that you potentially have, and you have to kind of uncover, recover yourself and your team from. So the scaling we went through was really fast. I was telling you, we're hiring 5 people every 2 weeks at one point and so I went from feet firm to on my heels to feeling like I went back to feet firm, but I definitely didn't. And then had a couple of things happen, as they're always going to in a new company and in game dev, and then spent 3-4 months that were really rough trying to recover from the fact that I was doing maybe 3 jobs at that time instead of 1.5 or 2.
Right.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up? You mentioned kind of scaling yourself. How do you guys make sort of quote unquote final calls on design choices, right? Like, is that sort of by committee? Is that by voting? Is that, anyone can sort of come in with data against you yourself as kind of the chief designer or, the creator, et cetera? Like, how do you think about that, especially as the game, balloons and gets bigger and bigger and bigger?
I very much try to create an environment in which, if you're coming in as a designer, as a product lead on the team, that you're going to have agency, and what the responsibility is for the person who's above you in the product lead role or the design role is to give clear enough strategy to align on the goals, stakeholder expectations, so as that people understand the area in which they have the autonomy to be able to move forward. I very much think if I've done a good job communicating the goals and I'm reviewing, the features and calling out where I think it's missing or not hitting a particular goal experience or a pillar for the game, then, might call it like goal-oriented design or something, but that's the kind of environment that we try to set up. Ultimately, the product lead above you or the designer and the kind of buck stops with me or Anthony, depending on the kind of problem you're talking about. It does go to that, but we try to make, vetoes or blocks be in the case that they result in us being like, okay, clearly we've missed articulating some part of the strategy or articulating some part of the goals. So let's make sure that's represented. And then people can go back and, figure out a solution again that works within that. And of course, you want to be clear about that up front, that like, hey, we're working on a new feature. We think these are the goals. If you run into something you think maybe one of these goals is incorrect or many of them are incorrect, let's have that discussion. And those are living things that we're going to iterate on. But we always want to start from that space.
Going back to the metric conversation, because I feel like I actually hear this all the time, where maybe somebody reads a lot into metrics in a sort of closed alpha or closed beta setting with a very small sample size, and live services or meta game that's not there yet, or just incomplete things like you were talking about. How do you make sure that you're not reading false signals, I guess? Like, how much do you trust your intuition on something and your conviction versus like, when do you pull in metrics at those early stages when you just don't have enough for sort of like meaningful data, I guess?
It is really hard. In an MMO, there are certain things you're never going to get that chance on.
Yeah.
And you have to accept some of that. And it makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, because we can do and support with a lot of data and a lot of playtests certain things like, oh, is fishing fun? Well, we can put fishing, the entire experience in front of you associated with that. Or if you play within a playtest period, you can have a sense of how it evolves over time. But, guilds and MMOs and guild-like experiences can be very difficult to create an authentic environment associated with some of those things. So, one, we exist in a world where there are a lot of other products out there that you can look at and learn from, and a lot of great writing and people who developed a lot of expertise around those things. So we regularly reach out to other people for expertise and help. And I absolutely encourage people to do that. And I've found way more often than not that people are, very willing and often even flattered that you're, asking for their expertise in a particular area. And if the lift is not too high, oftentimes you don't even necessarily have to, pay some consulting fee for it, but sometimes that's worth it too. So it really depends what is possible in terms of how you can increase your conviction in a particular space. For me, the less we are able to test to validate something, the more I care about building a strong case for why, this world or this reality makes sense and could exist, and still getting diverse people's perspectives and reviews around what holes or problems they might see in that coming about. But it is, things in that space also need to be protected in some ways too, because fundamentally, in some cases, if you're doing something totally new, someone might need to say, like, hey, this is the thing that I have very strong conviction on. These are the reasons, I've done all the homework that, you can reasonably be done here. And sometimes you're making a bet on someone or something or an idea.
Well, we could go on and on, I think, and we're already over. I would say you guys are like one of the first up, and we are all rooting for you. Absolutely. in the venture startup gaming community. I'm personally very excited about Palia, and it's just learned a lot. We usually end with one question, which is, if you could go back to the founding of Singularity 6, what is the most important piece of advice that you would give someone else that's starting with their new studio?
I'd say the one that was, for me, that was probably very personal is that you shouldn't try to do it all. I think people kind of, the hero is the word that people use for this particular, area of growth. You don't want to develop a culture where, you're essentially just constantly, everyone's having to be a hero all the time, every second. It's just not sustainable. And so, you do, coming into it as a founder, it's going to be a lot. It's going to be more than what, a regular job is going to ask you. And you go into that with that expectation. But figuring out where the line really is for you is super important. And it is a marathon and not a sprint. And you really need to have that mentality.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, and wish you the best of luck as you guys gear up for the launch.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Aidan.